There is a man who created the agency that protects your drinking water. There is a man who opened diplomatic relations with the most populous nation on Earth, ending decades of dangerous silence between two nuclear-armed worlds. There is a man who established the framework that modern presidents still use to justify secrecy, surveillance, and the expansion of executive power. And there is a man who broke into his political opponents' offices, lied about it for 2 years, and became the only president in American history to resign in disgrace. That man is the same man, Richard Milhouse Nixon, 37th President of the United States. And depending on who you ask, either a misunderstood statesman or the architect of a political culture so corrosive that we are still breathing its air today. Here is the uncomfortable truth about Nixon. He doesn't fit neatly into either box. He's not simply the villain your high school history teacher described, slumped in a chair sweating through a televised debate. But he's not the wrongly maligned genius that some of his defenders have tried to rehabilitate either. He was something far more interesting and far more dangerous than either of those clean narratives. He was a deeply intelligent, deeply insecure man, operating at the precise moment when the world was brittle enough that his particular combination of gifts and pathologies could leave permanent marks on the American system. And those marks are still there, right now, in the way your government classifies information, in the way political campaigns are run, in the language politicians use when they talk about crime, about drugs, about national security, about the press, in the legal arguments made in federal courts about what a president can and cannot do. Nixon's fingerprints are on all of it, so get comfortable. Settle in, because this is not just a story about the past. Nixon served as president from 1969 to 1974, which sounds like a narrow window until you look at what the world looked like on either side of it. He inherited an America that was coming apart at the seams. The 1960s had delivered one convulsion after another. Kennedy assassinated, then King, then Robert Kennedy. Cities burning, college campuses erupting, Vietnam grinding forward with no clear end, and an enormous cost in blood and treasure and public trust. By the time Nixon took the oath of office in January 1969, the country was exhausted, angry, and deeply uncertain about its institutions. At the same time, the world outside America's borders was organized around a single terrifying reality. The Cold War, two nuclear superpowers eyeing each other across a vast ideological divide, each capable of ending civilization in an afternoon. Every foreign policy decision, every domestic calculation, every move on the global chessboard was made with that shadow overhead. The threat was not theoretical. It was the defining anxiety of an entire generation. And into this specific moment stepped Richard Nixon, a man shaped by poverty and ambition, by resentment and relentless drive, by a career built on the politics of fear and a genuine fascination with the mechanics of global power. He was not a simple man. He never was. What you're going to hear over the course of this video is how the decisions made in those 5 years between 1969 and 1974 reach forward through time and land directly in the world you wake up to every morning. Foreign policy decisions that restructured the entire balance of global power. A political strategy so effective that both parties have borrowed from it ever since. An approach to executive authority that presidents of every stripe have quietly expanded upon. And a collapse of public trust so complete that polling on confidence in government has never fully recovered. Not in 50 years. The Nixon era also happened to coincide with a profound shift in the relationship between political leaders and the media. Television had already changed politics. Nixon knew this better than almost anyone, having survived one disastrous televised moment and rebuilt himself with deliberate care around others. But the Watergate scandal accelerated something. It created a new template for political journalism, one built around investigation and exposure, and the assumption that official statements should be treated as the beginning of a question rather than the end of one. That template still governs the relationship between the press and the powerful today. None of this means Nixon was solely responsible for the world we live in. History doesn't work that way. Every era is shaped by thousands of forces, and any single figure who gets credited with too much or blamed for too much is probably being used to tell a simpler story than the one that actually happened. But Nixon was consequential in a way that very few presidents have been. The things he did, the structures he built, the norms he shattered, the precedents he set, they have outlasted him by half a century, and they show no sign of fading. There is a particular kind of historical figure who defies easy summary. Not a hero, not a villain, but something more complicated and more instructive. Someone whose story forces you to sit with contradictions rather than resolve them. Nixon is that figure. Understanding him means understanding something real about power, about ambition, about what happens when a gifted but wounded person reaches the highest office in the world at exactly the wrong moment in history. Or maybe exactly the right one. We will start at the beginning. A small house in California. A family without much money. A boy who was, by most accounts, extraordinarily bright and quietly furious about things he couldn't quite name yet. Because who Richard Nixon became as president was inseparable from who Richard Nixon was before anyone had ever heard of him. That story begins in Yorba Linda. Yorba Linda, California, in the early 20th century was not a place that produced presidents. It was a small agricultural community in Orange County, dry and sunlit and unremarkable, the kind of place where ambition had to be carried quietly because there was nowhere obvious for it to go. Richard Nixon was born there on January 9, 1913, in a house his father had built by hand. It had no indoor plumbing. There were 5 boys in the family eventually, and money was something the Nixons always needed more of and rarely had. His father, Frank Nixon, was a loud, combative man who had tried and failed at a series of ventures before settling into running a small grocery store and gas station in Whittier, where the family eventually moved. He was the kind of man who picked fights with strangers over politics and didn't apologize for it. His mother, Hannah, was the opposite. Quiet, controlled, deeply Quaker in her sense of duty and self-denial. She didn't raise her voice. She endured. If Frank Nixon gave Richard his combativeness and his suspicion of those who looked down on him, Hannah gave him something colder and more durable. The ability to absorb pain without letting anyone see it working on him. 2 of Nixon's brothers died young. Harold, the eldest, died of tuberculosis in 1933 after a long illness that had drained the family's limited resources. Arthur died of encephalitis when Richard was a child. These losses were real and they were close, and the family didn't have the luxury of processing them at length. You got up and you went to work, and you kept going. That was the lesson the Nixon household taught, quietly but completely. What Richard took from all of this was discipline and insecurity in roughly equal measure. He was an exceptional student, the kind who read everything and remembered most of it, who competed ferociously for academic honors not just because he loved learning, but because achievement was the only ladder available to him. He was accepted to Harvard and Yale but couldn't afford to attend. He went to Whittier College instead, a small Quaker school close to home, and then to Duke University Law School on a scholarship, where he graduated 3rd in his class and studied with an intensity that his classmates found slightly unnerving. He wanted badly. That was the most observable thing about him. He wanted in the way that people want, when they have grown up feeling that the world has categorized them too quickly and too low, and when they are determined to make the world revise its opinion by force if necessary. Law school didn't lead directly to the prestigious East Coast firm he'd hoped for. The doors didn't open the way he expected, and the rejection lodged somewhere deep. He returned to Whittier and practiced law, and during the Second World War served in the Navy as a supply officer in the Pacific. He was not in combat, which he acknowledged, but the war did something to his sense of how large the world was beyond the California he had grown up in. He learned to play poker there, genuinely well, which tells you something about his feel for reading other people and managing risk, and playing a hand that doesn't show everything it holds. He came home from the war with a little money from those poker games and a political opportunity in front of him. A group of California Republicans were looking for someone to run against the Democratic incumbent Jerry Voorhis in the 12th Congressional District. They wanted a veteran. They wanted someone presentable. Nixon was 33 years old, and he was interested. What followed established the template for everything that came after. Nixon ran against Voorhis by tying him, somewhat loosely and with considerable creative license, to communist-linked political organizations. Voorhis was in fact a pretty conventional liberal Democrat, but the accusation didn't need to be precise to be effective. It needed to be loud, and Nixon was extraordinarily good at being loud in a controlled, lawyerly way that made the charge seem like something he regretted having to make. He won by 15 percentage points. Anti-communism was not a cynical affectation for Nixon, though he used it with a craftsman's skill. He genuinely believed that communist infiltration of American institutions was a serious threat, and the late 1940s provided enough real cases to make that belief defensible. What Nixon understood more clearly than most was that the threat, real or exaggerated, could be made politically productive. Fear is an extraordinary organizing tool. It moves people faster than hope does. His role in the Alger Hiss case cemented his national reputation. Hiss was a senior State Department official accused of being a Soviet spy. Nixon, then a congressman on the House Un-American Activities Committee, pursued the case with relentless methodical pressure, even when the investigation seemed to be going nowhere. His instincts turned out to be right, or at least well rewarded. Hiss was eventually convicted of perjury, and Nixon became nationally known almost overnight. He was not yet 40. He had been in Congress for less than 2 terms. He went to the Senate in 1950, again through a race against a Democrat he painted in communist-adjacent colors, and then in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower chose him as a running mate. He was 39 years old. He was one heartbeat from the presidency of the United States. The boy from the house with no plumbing had made it an enormous distance in a very short time. But something about the way he'd made that journey, the methods, the edge in the attacks, the willingness to imply the worst about opponents without quite saying it directly, that something was going to follow him for as long as his career lasted. It would never fully let him go. The Hiss case didn't just make Nixon famous. It made him a particular kind of famous, the kind that draws as much resentment as admiration, because what he had done was publicly humiliate a certain type of American that other Americans found threatening precisely because they couldn't quite get a grip on it. Alger Hiss was polished, educated, credentialed in every way that Richard Nixon was not. He had been to Harvard Law. He had clerked for Oliver Wendell Holmes. He moved through the upper rooms of American institutional life with the ease of someone born to them, and Nixon had taken him apart. There was something deeply personal in that, even if Nixon would never have admitted it. The man who had been turned away from the East Coast firms, who had studied by the dim light of a scholarship he'd clawed out of a school nobody had heard of, had brought down exactly the kind of man who had once closed those doors. Whether he had consciously framed it that way or not, plenty of people watching understood it in those terms. His supporters loved him for it. His enemies never quite forgave him for it. What the Hiss case gave Nixon beyond fame was a method. He had learned that patience combined with aggression was more effective than either alone. He had let the committee's investigation stall, had watched others lose interest, and had kept pressing at the seams until something gave. He had been relentless, and he had been right, or right enough, and those two things together made him almost impossible to dismiss. His critics called him ruthless. His supporters called him thorough. Both were describing the same behavior. The Senate race in 1950 continued in the same register. His opponent was Helen Gahagan Douglas, a congresswoman and actress and liberal Democrat who was genuinely formidable. Nixon's campaign distributed flyers on pink paper suggesting she was, in their chosen phrase, pink right down to her underwear, meaning soft on communism, sympathetic to Soviet interests. The pink sheet, as it became known, was not subtle. It was not meant to be. Douglas called him Tricky Dick, a nickname that attached itself to him so completely that decades later it was still the first thing millions of people thought of when they heard his name. He won the race by nearly 20 points. The nickname stayed. He was now a senator, and he was now Tricky Dick, and he was now a man that the Republican Party looked at with a complicated mixture of gratitude and unease. He was useful. He was effective. He was also the kind of ally who made you check your back pocket after the handshake. Eisenhower's decision to put Nixon on the ticket in 1952 was calculated in the way that all such decisions are calculated. Eisenhower was the hero, the general, the figure above politics. Nixon was the fighter, the man who would go into the rhetorical mud so that Eisenhower didn't have to. It was a partnership built on complementary needs rather than genuine affection. And both men knew it, and both men lived with it for 8 years. Then, before the campaign had properly gotten going, a newspaper revealed that Nixon had a secret fund, maintained by California donors, that he used for political expenses. It was not technically illegal, it looked terrible. Eisenhower's advisors began pushing the general to drop Nixon from the ticket. Nixon's career appeared to be ending before it had reached its actual destination. What happened next reshaped American politics in ways that are still working themselves out. Nixon went on national television. This was not the obvious move. Television was new. Politicians still mostly worked through newspapers and radio media they understood and had relationships with. Television was uncontrolled in ways that made experienced operatives nervous. The audience could see your hands. They could see whether your eyes moved when you were supposed to be speaking from conviction. It was intimate in a way that politics usually tried to avoid. Nixon sat in a studio with his wife Pat, and he talked for 30 minutes and he told America about his finances in a level of detail that was almost disorienting. He listed what he owned and what he owed. He described the modest circumstances of his life with a plainness that was either completely genuine or a performance of such precision that the distinction stopped mattering. And then near the end, he talked about a gift, a Cocker Spaniel puppy that a supporter had sent to his daughters, a black and white dog that his daughter Tricia had named Checkers. He said that regardless of what anyone said, they were keeping the dog. The Checkers speech, as it immediately became known, was mocked by the same sophisticated commentators who had mocked Nixon his entire career. It was corny. It was manipulative. It was shamelessly sentimental. All of those things were true. It was also one of the most effective pieces of political communication in American history. More than 1 million telegrams poured into Republican headquarters. The audience kept Nixon on the ticket. He remained Eisenhower's running mate, and in November, they won in a landslide. Nixon had learned something that night that would permanently alter how he thought about power. The press, the establishment, the people who occupied the same rooms as Alger Hiss, they were one audience. The country was another, and the country reached directly, bypassing all those intermediaries who looked down on him. The country was larger and in many ways more forgiving and considerably more accessible through the right kind of emotional frequency. Television didn't require polish. It required the appearance of authenticity. Those were very different skills, and Nixon turned out to have them. The vice presidency under Eisenhower was not a position of great formal authority, but Nixon used it with characteristic thoroughness. He traveled extensively, meeting heads of state, learning the texture of international politics at a granular level. In 1959, he stood in a model American kitchen at a trade exhibition in Moscow and argued with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev about the relative merits of capitalism and communism. The kitchen debate, captured on film and broadcast widely, showed Nixon holding his ground against an adversary who was trying to bully him, calm but unblinking, and it struck millions of Americans as exactly what they wanted their leaders to look like in the face of Soviet pressure. But the vice presidency also crystallized something in Nixon's understanding of loyalty and its limits. Eisenhower was not an uncomplicated patron. When Nixon was in crisis over the fund controversy, Eisenhower had not immediately defended him. He had waited to see how the wind was blowing. Nixon had gone on television alone. He had saved himself alone. And Eisenhower, when asked before the 1960 election to name a single major idea of Nixon's he had adopted during his administration, responded that given a week he might be able to think of one. Nixon absorbed that. He added it to the ledger he kept in some permanent part of his memory, the ledger of people who had not been there when he needed them, who had seen which way the current was running before committing. These years built in Nixon a precise and in some ways accurate map of how American politics actually worked, as opposed to how it presented itself. The press would never be his ally. The establishment would tolerate him when he was useful and move to cut him when he wasn't. Television was the great equalizer, the medium through which he could speak past all of it directly to the people who were suspicious of the same things he was suspicious of. Loyalty was real, but it was also fragile, and you could not afford to assume it from people who had other options. He was 47 years old. He had been in national politics for a decade, and had spent those years learning lessons that almost no other politician of his generation had learned as completely. Some of those lessons were about governance. More of them were about survival. And the difference between those two categories was a distinction that Richard Nixon, in the decade that followed, would have increasing difficulty maintaining. The 1960 presidential campaign was supposed to be the moment all of those lessons paid off. On paper, Nixon was well positioned, 8 years as vice president, a reputation as tough on communism, a command of policy that was real, not cosmetic. He had traveled the world. He knew the files. He had, he thought, done the apprenticeship that American politics demanded. His opponent was John F. Kennedy, a first-term senator from Massachusetts, young, wealthy and charismatic in a way that made Nixon uneasy, not because he didn't understand it, but because he understood it too well. Kennedy was in many ways another Alger Hiss, prep schools, Harvard, ease in the world that Nixon had had to batter his way into. But Kennedy was also something new, a politician built for the TV age in a way that Nixon, for all his skill with the medium, could not quite match. The two men met in the first televised presidential debates in American history. Millions watched them at home. Nixon had been in the hospital recently. He refused makeup. He wore a light suit that blended into the pale studio backdrop. He looked tired. Kennedy looked like he had been designed by a committee that had been given one brief: make someone America will trust on sight. On radio, people who only heard the words tended to think Nixon had done as well, or better. On TV, the verdict was different. Kennedy appeared calm, confident, almost glowing. Nixon appeared tense, sweating, his jaw clenched in ways that cameras could see and amplify. The country, increasingly a television audience, absorbed that contrast. The election itself was brutally close. The popular vote margin was a fraction of a percent. There were irregularities in Illinois and Texas that Nixon's advisors wanted to challenge. He knew how to fight. He knew how to keep pressing at seams until something gave. But he also knew something about the country's tolerance for visible conflict over legitimacy. A protracted battle over recounts and fraud would have dragged the Cold War presidency into an open question. He conceded, publicly. He did the orthodox thing. He congratulated Kennedy and spoke of unity. Privately, another entry went into the ledger. Once again, a man with easier access to the rooms of power had edged him out, and once again the referees had not seemed especially concerned about the details of how. 2 years later, he tried to reverse that verdict closer to home. Having nearly been president, he ran for governor of California in 1962, a move that many people around him did not fully understand. The governorship would give him a base, a platform, and something like an independent power center. It would also, if he lost, make the 1960 defeat look less like bad luck and more like a pattern. He lost. The campaign was messy, unfocused. Nixon, still nursing the wounds of 1960, warred simultaneously against his Democratic opponent and against the press, which he believed had treated him unfairly for years and which he now attacked with less restraint. The voters, watching a man who had almost been president fight for a lesser office as if it were a personal vendetta, pulled back. On election night, after the results were clear, Nixon spoke to the press in words that would follow him for decades. "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore," he said. It sounded like a man slamming the door on a lifetime of slights. It also sounded, to a country used to seeing its politicians smile their way through defeat, like something uncomfortably raw. At 49, he was widely written off as finished. Commentators spoke of him in the past tense. Kennedy occupied the White House. A new generation, it seemed, had arrived. The restless, striving man from Yorba Linda was, for the moment, out of the frame. Those years in the political wilderness were not idle. Nixon practiced law, he wrote. He traveled. He watched. He watched John F. Kennedy's shimmering promise end in a motorcade in Dallas. He watched Lyndon Johnson, a master of Congress, drag civil rights legislation into law over the resistance of men who had built their careers defending segregation. He watched American advisors in Vietnam become American troops in Vietnam, watched the numbers climb, watched body counts become part of the nightly news. He watched the cities burn. Watts in 1965, Detroit and Newark and dozens of others in 1967. He watched student protests swell on college campuses, public challenges to authority that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. He watched the Democratic Party fracture over race, over war, over what kind of country it wanted to be. And he watched the people who were not in the streets. For every marcher, for every student with a sign, there were neighbors watching from their living rooms. Older couples in suburbs built on the promise that history could be kept at arm's length. Factory workers who did not see themselves in the language of revolution. White voters in the South angry about civil rights, but uncomfortable with open segregationist rhetoric. Ethnic Catholics in northern cities who felt besieged by change coming from every direction at once. Nixon, in exile, reoriented his instincts toward them. He began to think in terms of a majority that did not shout. People who paid their taxes, went to work, sent their children to school, and watched an America on television that looked increasingly unfamiliar to them. They were anxious, resentful, sometimes fearful, and they had no obvious spokesman who could voice those feelings in a way that sounded respectable rather than extremist. The phrase that crystallized this was not his invention. Pollsters and columnists had played with versions of it, but he understood it with a clarity they did not: the silent majority. The idea that the country was still fundamentally made up of ordinary people who did not protest, did not burn draft cards, did not occupy administration buildings, but who increasingly felt that the institutions that were supposed to speak for them had stopped listening. Wrapped around that idea was another, less openly advertised: law and order. The words were simple. Who would argue, at least at the level of abstraction, against laws being enforced and order being maintained? But in the late 1960s, those words carried a cargo of associations that did not need to be spelled out loudly to be heard clearly. Law and order meant an end to riots. It meant a firm hand against crime. It meant, to many white voters, a way of talking about race without quite talking about race. It meant, to many who were tired of protests against the war, a restoration of hierarchy, of deference, of quiet. Nixon learned to speak this language fluently. Not with the theatrical rage of the segregationist demagogue, but with a lawyer's cadence, a man promising stability, calm, a return to something that felt normal. He framed himself not as the resentful loser of 1962, but as the steady hand in a storm of chaos, the only major figure who seemed to take seriously the unease of people who watched the decade's upheavals with dread rather than hope. He cultivated donors again, carefully, methodically. He traveled the country campaigning for Republican candidates in 1966, building a network of obligations. Each visit was a reminder: he was still here, still loyal, still useful. He collected favors the way other men collected stamps. He remembered who owed him, and he assumed correctly that he would eventually call those debts in. What emerged from those wilderness years was not a different Richard Nixon so much as a refined version of the one who had always been there. The suspicion of elites was now a central plank of his appeal, not just a private grievance. The lesson of television had deepened. He no longer tried to match the Kennedys on glamour. He leaned into a kind of ordinary stiffness that, to many viewers, read as seriousness rather than lack of charm. The careful, patient aggressor of the His case was still present, but now the target was less a single man than a whole era's worth of perceived disorder. By the time 1968 approached, the country was exhausted and divided. The war in Vietnam was bleeding lives and credibility. Cities had endured wave after wave of unrest. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were dead. The Democratic Convention in Chicago would soon unfold in tear gas and televised violence. Into that atmosphere stepped a man who had lost a presidency and a governorship, who had sworn he would not be around to be kicked, and who had spent the intervening years listening, planning, and waiting for exactly this kind of breakdown. Richard Nixon, the political exile who had once seemed finished, was ready to present himself as something paradoxical, the embodiment of order in an age that no longer trusted the people it had once called its natural leaders. He had found his road back, and it ran straight through the fears and longings of the silent majority. 1968 did not feel like an election year so much as a controlled fall. The war in Vietnam was no longer a distant commitment managed by experts in Washington. It was a nightly ritual of body counts and burning villages. 500,000 American troops were deployed. The government said there was light at the end of the tunnel. Then, at the end of January, the Tet Offensive exploded across South Vietnam. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces struck cities and bases that had been described as secure. The offensive was, militarily, a failure for Hanoi. Politically, it was a catastrophe for Washington. Americans watched their leaders' assurances collapse in real time. At home, the country felt like a shaken snow globe that never settled. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. More than 100 cities erupted in grief and rage. Soldiers guarded the Capitol. Smoke hung over Washington. 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy, who had entered the Democratic primaries as a charismatic critic of the war and poverty, was shot in Los Angeles on the night of his California victory. For people who had invested their hopes in the Kennedys, it felt like history closing a door with finality. In the streets, in campuses, in neighborhoods, it seemed like every line of conflict was exposed at once. Race, war, generational rebellion, the legitimacy of institutions. The basic question of what counted as patriotism and what counted as treason. And in the middle of that, the 1968 presidential election demanded that the country choose a direction. Lyndon Johnson, worn down by Vietnam and battered by his own party's revolt, announced in March that he would not seek re-election. That decision shattered what remained of the old Democratic alignment. Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's loyal vice president, entered the race without having run in a single primary. He became the stand-in for a weary establishment, a man personally sympathetic to civil rights and social programs, but chained to a war he had not started and did not fully control. Humphrey's problem was that he represented the thing the country no longer trusted, the idea that if you stayed the course and let experienced men manage events, the chaos would eventually subside. He tried, haltingly, to distance himself from Johnson on Vietnam. Each step risked alienating the president's loyalists. Each hesitation infuriated the anti-war movement. He was squeezed between people who thought the system could still be bent toward justice and people who had decided the system itself was the problem. On the other side of the spectrum, there was George Wallace. The former governor of Alabama had once stood in a schoolhouse door to block black students from enrolling. By 1968, he presented himself as the blunt voice of the white backlash. Running as a third-party candidate on the American Independent Party ticket, Wallace said out loud what many white voters were thinking but did not feel permitted to say in polite company. He denounced busing, rioters, federal judges, intellectuals. His crowds were not quiet. They did not want nuance. They wanted someone to tell them that the world they remembered could be restored by force of will. Wallace's presence in the race was important for two reasons. He showed how much anger was available to be harvested among white voters who felt besieged by civil rights and protest. And he demonstrated that a candidate did not need to win the presidency to have leverage. By threatening to peel off states in the South and border regions, he could potentially throw the election to the House of Representatives and bargain from there. Between Humphrey, tied to a discredited war, and Wallace, openly courting segregationist sentiment, Richard Nixon carved out a third role, the candidate of law and order who spoke in the measured tones of legitimacy. Nixon's law and order message was deceptively simple. He did not shout. He did not openly endorse Wallace's racial language. Instead, he talked about restoring respect for the law, ending riots, and standing with the great majority of Americans, the forgotten Americans, the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators. He married that language to a promise that he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam with honor. He did not provide details. He provided reassurance. Underneath the calm phrasing, there was a hard strategic edge. Nixon and his advisors understood that the New Deal coalition that had dominated American politics for a generation was cracking. For decades, the Democratic Party had been an uneasy alliance. Northern liberals, Southern segregationists, urban ethnic machines, unions, black voters in cities. Civil rights legislation in the 1960s, pushed through by Johnson, began to tear that coalition apart. Many white Southerners felt betrayed by the National Democratic Party. Many Northern white ethnics felt increasingly estranged from the party's embrace of protest and rapid social change. Nixon saw an opening. He did not need to win the South outright in 1968. Wallace would do some of that work for him. What Nixon needed was to begin the process of making the Republican Party a plausible home for disaffected white Southern and working-class voters without alienating moderate suburbanites. This is where the Southern strategy took form. Publicly, it was framed in terms of states' rights, local control, and opposition to forced integration and busing. Privately, Nixon's team spoke with less euphemism. They studied where resentment about civil rights was strongest. They tailored messages that signaled sympathy without using the explicit language of Jim Crow. They courted Southern politicians who had once been Democrats with the promise that their values would be respected in a Republican administration. The strategy worked in stages. In 1968, Nixon did not sweep the South. Wallace took 5 Southern states. But Nixon cracked the region, carrying others that had been solidly Democratic for decades. In the North, his law and order pitch, combined with weariness over the war and fear of unrest, pulled in Catholic and blue-collar voters who had been part of the old Democratic base. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago that summer crystallized the contrast Nixon wanted. Outside the convention hall, police and protesters clashed in scenes broadcast more or less live into American living rooms. Inside, Humphrey secured the nomination through delegates loyal to the party machine, not through primary voters. To many watching, it looked like a party at war with itself while the country burned. Nixon's campaign presented him as the alternative. Serious, controlled, speaking for the people who watched Chicago on television and felt only dread. He spoke about bringing us together, but the us in his speeches was carefully defined. It centered the silent majority, those who were not in the streets, who wanted the noise to stop, who believed that something fundamental had slipped. In November, Nixon won, but not by a landslide. The popular vote was close. Humphrey rallied late as he inched away from Johnson's Vietnam policy. Wallace carved out a significant share of the vote in the South and among white working-class voters elsewhere. The map, however, told a deeper story than the margin. The Republican Party had begun to trade its identity as the party of Lincoln and the industrial Northeast for a new coalition anchored in the Sun Belt, the suburbs, and an increasingly conservative white South. The Democratic Party, battered but still dominant in Congress, was now more firmly associated with civil rights, anti-war activism, and a vision of government that many anxious voters saw as experimental and risky. 1968 became a turning point because it rearranged the logic of American politics. From that year forward, presidential campaigns would speak, more and more, in code about crime and welfare, about order and culture, about the suburbs and the cities. The language Nixon used, silent majority, law and order, states' rights, became a template for how politicians could talk about race, protest, and inequality without naming them directly. The coalitions that solidified in the aftermath of 1968 still structure American politics. The alignment of the white South with the Republican Party, the identification of Democrats with civil rights and social movements, the habit of invoking crime and riots to win elections, all of these were accelerated by the choices made that year. Richard Nixon did not invent all of this, but he was the first major figure to assemble these pieces into a coherent national strategy, to build a path to power on the fears and longings of voters who felt the 1960s had left them behind. In doing so, he helped create the political landscape you live in now, where debates over law and order, protest, and who speaks for the real America still echo with the tones first amplified in 1968. Nixon took office promising a secret plan to end the war. What he actually inherited was not a problem to be solved, but a trap. By January 1969, more than 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam. 30,000 Americans had already died. The war was deeply unpopular, especially among the young, but it had also become entangled with America's image of itself. To leave suddenly risked looking weak in the Cold War, betraying allies and confirming that the lives already lost had been spent for nothing. To stay meant more deaths, more protests, and a steady erosion of trust in government. Nixon's campaign slogan on Vietnam had been "Peace with honor." The phrase did a lot of work. Peace reassured the war-weary. Honor reassured those who feared retreat. Beneath it sat a grim calculation: how many more people would have to die, and for how long, before the departure could be framed as dignified rather than defeated. The policy that emerged was called Vietnamization. In theory, Vietnamization was simple. The United States would gradually withdraw its ground troops while building up the South Vietnamese army to take over the fighting. American boys, Nixon would say, would no longer have to fight a war Asian boys should be fighting for themselves. In practice, this meant a slow unwinding rather than a clean break. American troop levels began to fall, but the war did not end. Combat operations continued. Bombing intensified. Draft calls stayed high. Families who had watched their sons go to Vietnam under Johnson now watched them go under Nixon. The faces in the casualty lists kept changing. The policy framework did not. Vietnamization was not just a military strategy. It was political theater. Each troop reduction announcement was timed carefully, often following periods of public unrest or bad news. Nixon and his advisors understood that Americans wanted to feel movement toward an exit. They also feared that a rapid exit would be politically catastrophic if Saigon fell immediately afterward. So they tried to manage reality and perception simultaneously, lessen visible American involvement, maintain pressure on the enemy, and stretch the timeline long enough to claim that South Vietnam had been given a fair chance to stand. This is where Cambodia enters the story. On a map, Cambodia was a small neighboring country. On Nixon's strategic board, it looked like a solution. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces used sanctuaries across the Cambodian border to rest, store supplies, and move along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. If those sanctuaries could be hit, Nixon believed, he could weaken the enemy, strengthen the South Vietnamese, and perhaps force Hanoi to negotiate. Secretly and then more openly, the war expanded. As you heard earlier, the bombing of Cambodia had already begun in 1969, ordered in secrecy and hidden from Congress through falsified reports. In April 1970, Nixon went further. He announced that American and South Vietnamese troops had crossed the border into Cambodia on a limited incursion. He framed it as necessary to protect withdrawing American forces, to keep faith with prisoners of war, and to shorten the war overall. Many Americans heard something different. After years of assurances that Vietnam was under control, that the war would not spread, here was the president announcing that it had done exactly that. The idea of a wider war in Southeast Asia, once dismissed as alarmism, now looked like current policy. The domestic backlash was immediate and intense. College campuses erupted in protest. In May 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, National Guard troops opened fire on students during an anti-war demonstration, killing 4 and wounding 9. 10 days later, police in Mississippi killed 2 students at Jackson State. The images of young Americans shot by agents of their own government for protesting a war they had never voted for sank deep into the national memory. Nixon liked to speak of the silent majority that supported his policies. But the Cambodia expansion helped crystallize a different majority sentiment, that the government was not telling the truth about what it was doing in Southeast Asia, or why. This distrust did not begin with Nixon. Johnson's administration had already eroded confidence through optimistic claims that clashed with the nightly news from Vietnam. But under Nixon, the pattern hardened. Secret bombings, concealed decisions, public statements that seemed to float free from the facts. Then, in 1971, came the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were not Nixon's documents. They were a classified Defense Department history commissioned under Johnson, detailing how the United States had become entangled in Vietnam from the 1940s through the late 1960s. When portions were leaked to the New York Times by analyst Daniel Ellsberg, the story they told was bleak. The documents showed that presidents and their top advisors from both parties had repeatedly misled Congress and the public about the war. They revealed private doubts about winning even as public promises insisted on victory. They described a long series of escalations justified by half-truths and omissions. Nixon's first instinct was to let the documents embarrass his predecessors. After all, much of the deception traced back to Kennedy and Johnson. But another instinct overrode that, the desire to assert control, to punish leaks, to prevent a precedent that might expose his own secrets. The administration went to court to try to block publication, claiming national security. It lost. The Supreme Court ruled that prior restraint of the press in this case violated the First Amendment. Newspapers kept printing. Americans kept reading about how their leaders had shaded, trimmed, and concealed the path to war. The content of the Pentagon Papers mattered. The reaction to them mattered more. What people saw was a pattern. The government had not simply made mistakes. It had lied. Not once. Not accidentally. Systematically over years across administrations. The phrase credibility gap, already in circulation, became less a slogan and more a diagnosis. The distance between official claims and observable reality was no longer a gap. It felt like a chasm. Nixon, who privately shared many of the suspicions that ordinary Americans now voiced about the establishment, did not respond by rebuilding trust. He responded by constructing a more secretive, more insulated presidency. The obsession with leaks that surfaced in the Pentagon Papers fight helped lead to the creation of the Plumbers, the group tasked with stopping information from escaping the White House. The habits of secrecy and us versus them thinking hardened in these years, setting the stage for Watergate. Meanwhile, the war went on. American ground forces declined, but bombing campaigns continued in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. South Vietnamese troops, funded and equipped by the United States, took on more direct fighting. The draft remained a looming presence in young people's lives until the early 1970s. Families watched negotiations in Paris drag on, ceasefires collapse, and casualty figures accumulate. By the time a peace agreement was finally signed in 1973, ending direct American military involvement, more than 58,000 Americans and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians had died. 2 years later, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces. Helicopters lifted off from the embassy roof. The image entered the American psyche as a kind of punctuation mark. Whatever peace with honor had meant, it did not look like victory. The Vietnam War left behind more than graves and damaged landscapes. It left behind a deep, persistent skepticism about official narratives. From that point forward, Americans learned to hear government assurances with an internal footnote. This is what they're saying now. The habit of questioning casualty counts, exit strategies, and vague promises of progress became part of the culture. When later presidents asked for public trust in wars in Central America, in the Persian Gulf, in Iraq and Afghanistan, Vietnam hovered in the background as a warning. Nixon did not start that war. He did not invent deception in foreign policy. But the way his administration managed, prolonged, and tried to control the story of Vietnam burned into the public mind an enduring lesson that leaders, when cornered between admitting failure and redefining success, often choose the latter and call it peace. The burdens of peace that Nixon carried out of Vietnam were not only the struggles of veterans returning to a divided country or the diplomatic knots left in Southeast Asia. They were the burdens of a shattered confidence, a citizenry less willing to believe, more inclined to suspect, and a presidency more inclined to operate behind closed doors, convinced that sunlight itself was a threat. You still live with that legacy every time a new conflict begins. And the first questions that arise are not about the enemy, but about whether you can trust the people asking you to fight. While Vietnam consumed attention and trust at home, Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, were working on something else entirely, a new way to play the Cold War. For a generation, American policy had been built on a simple picture. There was us, the free world, and there was them, usually described as a single monolithic communism stretching from Moscow to Beijing to Hanoi. Contain it, defeat it, hold the line. Nixon and Kissinger looked at that map and saw something different. They saw three major powers, not two: the United States, the Soviet Union, and the People's Republic of China, each with its own interests, fears, and rivalries. If you could play those 3 points off one another, you might be able to manage the Cold War instead of simply endure it. This was the logic of what came to be called triangular diplomacy. The United States had spent 2 decades refusing to recognize the communist government in Beijing. Officially, China was still the nationalist regime on Taiwan. American politicians competed to sound toughest on Red China. Schoolchildren learned about the loss of China as a kind of original sin of the Cold War. And then, in 1972, Richard Nixon went to Beijing. To understand why that landing was so shocking, you have to understand who Nixon had been. He made his name in politics attacking Democrats for being soft on communism. He rose to prominence chasing alleged communists in the State Department. As vice president, he had championed hardline policies in Asia. If any American leader was least likely to shake hands with Mao Zedong, it was Richard Nixon. That was precisely why he could. A liberal Democrat opening relations with China would have been accused of betrayal. Nixon's long record as an anti-communist gave him political cover. He could do something that would have destroyed other careers and survive. The opening to China did not begin with that famous visit. For months before, Kissinger had been slipping around the world, meeting Chinese officials in secret, using Pakistan as a go-between. Communications were routed through back channels. Messages were written cautiously, almost poetically, as both sides tested how far they could go without provoking a crisis. The decision to move forward rested on cold calculations in all three capitals. In Beijing, Mao and Premier Zhou Enlai were increasingly wary of the Soviet Union. Border clashes between Soviet and Chinese forces in 1969 had raised the specter of a full-scale war. Facing a hostile Moscow to the north and an unfriendly Washington to the east, China saw value in easing one of those threats. In Washington, Nixon saw a chance to exploit the growing Sino-Soviet split. If China could be brought even partially into a relationship with the United States, the Soviets would find themselves less secure. They would have to worry about a two-front diplomatic struggle, perhaps even a two-front war. In Moscow, Soviet leaders watched these moves with alarm. For years they had claimed leadership of the global communist movement. Now the United States was courting their biggest rival on the communist side. This was exactly the pressure Nixon wanted. The visit to China in February 1972 unfolded like both diplomacy and theater. Nixon met Mao. He toured the Great Wall. He issued, along with his hosts, the Shanghai Communique, a carefully worded statement that laid out areas of agreement and disagreement. The United States acknowledged that there was one China and that Taiwan was part of that China, while maintaining its own ties with Taipei. Both sides expressed interest in a peaceful settlement of Taiwan's status. Trade and cultural exchanges were encouraged. Full diplomatic normalization would take years, but the wall of isolation had cracked. Americans watching from their living rooms saw something that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier: an American president walking through Tiananmen Square, toasting leaders he had once described as enemies of civilization. The shock value was part of the strategy. Not long after Nixon left Beijing, he flew to Moscow. Within the same year, he had visited both capitals that had once been depicted as a single unified enemy. In the Soviet Union, Nixon and General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev embraced a different word: détente. A relaxation of tensions, not friendship, not alliance, but a managed rivalry. Out of that visit came some of the most important arms control agreements of the Cold War. One was the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, or ABM Treaty. It limited the number of missile defense systems each side could build. This sounded counterintuitive to many Americans. Why would you restrict your ability to shoot down incoming nukes? The logic, again, was cold and mathematical. If one side believed it could build defenses strong enough to survive a nuclear exchange, it might be tempted to strike first. Mutual vulnerability, as grim as it sounded, was stabilizing. No one could win, therefore no one should start. Another agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, produced the first SALT Treaty. It capped the number of strategic nuclear launchers on each side. It did not end the arms race. It did not eliminate existing weapons. But it was the first time the United States and the Soviet Union formally agreed to put ceilings on their accumulation of nuclear firepower. Alongside these, there were deals on trade and scientific cooperation. American wheat would feed Soviet livestock. Joint space projects were envisioned. The image of unrelenting hostility softened into something more complex: competitors who also had to share a fragile planet. Triangular diplomacy was at work in all of this. When Nixon courted Beijing, he signaled to Moscow that the United States had options. When he signed agreements in Moscow, he signaled to Beijing that the Soviets were willing to talk. Both communist giants, wary of each other, now had to consider Washington in their calculations. Instead of facing a solid communist bloc, the United States was now the potential partner of each side against the other. That leverage allowed Nixon and Kissinger to extract concessions, shape negotiations over Vietnam, and begin to lower the temperature of a Cold War that had nearly gone nuclear over Cuba just a decade earlier. This strategy did not end conflicts. The Soviet Union would invade Afghanistan later in the decade. China would move through its own upheavals. The arms race continued in new forms. But the framework Nixon helped build, talking even with adversaries, exploiting divisions within rival camps, using engagement and pressure together, became part of the standard toolkit of American foreign policy. When later presidents opened negotiations with the Soviet Union on deeper arms reductions, they did so on the foundation laid in the early 1970s. When the United States normalized relations fully with China under Jimmy Carter, it was carrying forward a door that Nixon had first pushed ajar. When leaders today speak of great power competition or balance of power in Asia, they are using concepts that Nixon tried to reintroduce into American thinking. You still live with this logic in quieter ways. Every time Washington weighs how to handle Russia and China at the same time, it is implicitly working inside Nixon's triangle, asking whether closer ties with one might shape the behavior of the other, whether dialogues on arms control can coexist with rivalry, whether it is possible to be someone's adversary and negotiating partner at once. The shadow of those trips in 1972 stretches into the present, into trade disputes with China, into ongoing treaties and arguments over nuclear weapons, into the habit of seeing world politics not just as good versus evil, but as a shifting geometry of powers, interests, and uneasy bargains. At home, Nixon was often consumed by secrecy and suspicion. Abroad, he tried to build a more stable structure out of the same instincts. Keep your enemies guessing, keep your options open, and never let anyone forget that you have somewhere else to turn. While Nixon was flying between Beijing and Moscow, something quieter was happening in Washington. The same president who talked about law and order, who ran as a conservative, was building one of the most expansive domestic regulatory states in American history. This is one of the central contradictions of Richard Nixon. He distrusted government in the abstract, especially bureaucrats, liberals, and journalists. He ran against big government and the permissive culture of the 1960s. But when it came time to govern, he reached for federal power again and again, signing laws and creating agencies that still shape the air you breathe, the water you drink, and the safety rules at your job. Start with the environment. In the late 1960s, pollution in the United States was hard to ignore. Rivers caught fire. Smog turned city air brown. Bald eagles were dying off. A new environmental movement was gaining strength. Earth Day was first celebrated in 1970. Public opinion was shifting fast. Nixon was not, by temperament, an environmental idealist. In private, he sometimes mocked environmentalists, but he was an astute reader of politics. He saw that anger over pollution cut across party lines. Suburban Republicans and urban Democrats both wanted their kids to have clean air and water. So he moved. In 1970, Nixon proposed the creation of a new agency that would pull together scattered environmental responsibilities from across the federal government. That agency became the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. He created it by executive reorganization and then worked with Congress to give it teeth. Under Nixon, the EPA and Congress produced some of the most sweeping environmental laws ever passed. The Clean Air Act of 1970 set national standards for air quality and gave the federal government authority to regulate emissions from factories, power plants, and cars. It required states to develop plans to meet those standards and allowed Washington to step in if they failed. The Clean Water Act, passed in 1972 over Nixon's veto, established a framework for regulating discharges into rivers, lakes, and coastal waters. It set a goal, though never fully reached, of eliminating pollution discharges by industry. The Endangered Species Act, signed by Nixon in 1973, gave the federal government the power to protect species at risk of extinction and the ecosystems they depended on. These laws were not symbolic. They created enforceable rules, backed by federal inspectors, fines, and court orders. They forced industries to install scrubbers on smokestacks, change chemical processes, and redesign cars. They pushed cities to build better sewage treatment plants. If you live in an American city today and the air is clearer than it was in 1970, if you swim in rivers that were once dead zones, you are living inside the regulatory architecture that took shape under a president who liked to talk about limiting government. And Nixon's domestic reach didn't stop with the environment. Workplace safety, something often taken for granted now, was transformed on his watch. Before 1970, more than 14,000 workers died on the job in the United States every year. Many more were maimed or sickened. States had patchy, inconsistent laws. Some industries were barely regulated at all. Injuries were often treated as the cost of doing business. In 1970, Nixon signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act. That law created OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. OSHA was empowered to set and enforce standards for workplace conditions. It could inspect factories, issue citations, and require changes. It covered hazards from toxic chemicals to noisy machinery to unguarded equipment. The law also created the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health to research risks and recommend protections. Again, business groups protested. Again, Nixon moved forward. If your employer today has to follow rules about protective gear, machine guards, exposure to fumes, or emergency exits, you are living with the legacy of that moment. The decline in workplace deaths and injuries since 1970 is one of the quiet success stories of modern regulation. Consumer protection also expanded. Nixon signed into law measures that regulated dangerous products, improved labeling, and strengthened agencies overseeing food and drugs. He supported the creation of a new body, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which would come just after his presidency, but was rooted in this era's momentum. Auto safety requirements, building codes, limitations on lead in products, these tightened under the broader regulatory climate he helped normalize. At the same time, he was experimenting with a different idea, returning money and some decision-making power to the states and localities. This was called revenue sharing. Instead of Washington collecting taxes and then funding narrowly defined programs with strict rules, Nixon proposed sending a portion of federal tax revenues back to state and local governments with fewer strings attached. The idea was that local officials closer to their communities could decide how best to spend the funds. on schools, roads, public safety, or social services. Nixon presented this as a way to decentralize power, to shrink the influence of distant federal agencies. In speeches, he talked about restoring authority to the people and their local representatives. But the money still flowed from Washington. The federal government still stood at the center of the system. It was collecting, allocating, and writing the broad conditions. The checks came with the seal of the United States government on them. So even as Nixon talked about limiting Washington, he was embedding it more deeply in everyday life, as the guardian of environmental standards, as the referee of workplace safety, as a partner in local budgets. This tension ran through his rhetoric and his actions. In public, he aligned himself with conservatives wary of bureaucracy and social engineering. He attacked welfare cheats, promised to restore order, and criticized what he saw as liberal overreach. In practice, he accepted much of the New Deal and Great Society framework and, in some areas, expanded it. He proposed, for example, a kind of guaranteed minimum income for families, the Family Assistance Plan, that would have reshaped welfare. It ultimately failed in Congress, opposed by liberals who thought it too stingy and conservatives who feared it would discourage work. But the fact that a Republican president put such an idea on the table shows how fluid the boundaries of big government were in that moment. Nixon also signed laws expanding food stamps and indexing Social Security benefits to inflation, changes that made those programs more durable and generous over time. The pattern is hard to miss. He talked like a small government conservative, governed like a pragmatic manager, and left behind a larger, more complex federal apparatus. Many of the debates you hear today about the EPA's authority, about OSHA inspections, about whether Washington should set national rules or let states decide, are arguments inside the House Nixon helped renovate. When a factory is fined for dumping waste, when a company recalls a dangerous product, when a city budget relies on federal funds to keep buses running or clinics open, you're seeing the domestic face of a presidency often remembered only for foreign trips and scandal. The same instincts that drove Nixon to manage the global balance of power drove him at home. He wanted leverage, tools, and options. He was willing to expand government power if it helped him solve problems, or build coalitions even as he spoke the language of restraint. That contradiction between the story politicians tell about government and the government they actually build is one of his legacies. You still live in its shadow every time you walk into a workplace made safer by federal rules, drink water tested under federal standards, or listen to arguments about whether Washington has gone too far while relying on systems that were strengthened by a president who promised to hold it back. While Nixon was helping to build this larger regulatory state, he was also doing something else. He was teaching Republicans and eventually much of American politics how to talk about crime, drugs, and disorder in a way that sounded neutral but carried very specific meanings. In 1968, his campaign message was simple: law and order. The phrase sounded straightforward. Who doesn't want safety? Who doesn't want laws enforced? But in the late 1960s, law and order meant a lot more than just reducing crime. Cities had been rocked by uprisings after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. College campuses saw protests against the Vietnam War. The civil rights movement had forced confrontations with police and local authorities. The old racial order of Jim Crow was crumbling. Many white voters, especially in the suburbs and the South, felt unsettled. They saw images of burning buildings, marches, and clashes on the evening news. They heard about rising crime rates in cities. They worried about cultural change. Nixon and his advisors understood this anxiety very well. In campaign strategy memos, they talked about appealing to a silent majority of Americans. People who, in their telling, worked hard, followed the rules, and felt that the country was slipping away from them. Law and order was how they reached those voters. Publicly, Nixon insisted his concern was crime, not race. Privately, his team knew the overlap. One of his aides, John Ehrlichman, later described the logic bluntly. He claimed that the administration could not criminalize being black or being anti-war, but they could associate those groups with drugs, then crack down on drugs, and thereby discredit and disrupt their communities. Whether every detail of that recollection is exact or not, it captured something real about the way politics was practiced. The point was not just to reduce crime, it was to reshape the political map. Once in office, Nixon turned the language of law and order into policy. He expanded federal funding for local police departments. Through a new Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the federal government sent money for equipment, training, and research. Washington began to play a larger role in how cities and states policed their streets. This was a shift. For most of American history, crime had been considered a local issue. Towns, counties, and states set their own priorities. The federal government focused on a narrow band of federal crimes. Under Nixon, crime and policing became national political issues. Presidents would now be judged on crime statistics. Campaigns would talk about crackdowns and toughness. Legislation in Washington would shape what happened on city corners and in county jails. And then there were drugs. The modern war on drugs did not begin with Nancy Reagan's Just Say No. It began with Richard Nixon. In 1971, he declared drug abuse public enemy number one and announced a war on drugs. He framed it as a national emergency that required more police, more prosecutors, and more prisons. Congress helped. Under Nixon, the United States adopted the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which reorganized drug laws and created schedules of illegal substances. It placed marijuana, heroin, LSD, and many other drugs into tightly regulated categories, setting penalties and restrictions that still shape enforcement today. Nixon created a new White House Office for Drug Policy Coordination. He pushed for harsher penalties for drug trafficking and supported no-knock search laws that allowed police to enter homes without warning in certain cases. He established the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, in 1973, merging several agencies into a single force focused on drug control at home and abroad. Some parts of his approach recognized addiction as a health issue. His administration quietly funded methadone programs and treatment research, but in public, the emphasis was overwhelmingly on enforcement, not care. The rhetoric was about crime. The effect fell heavily along racial lines. Black and Latino communities were more heavily policed. Arrests for drug offenses increased. Sentences grew longer. Even though drug use existed in all communities, enforcement focused on particular neighborhoods. Nixon did not invent racially unequal policing. That history stretched back through slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. But he helped nationalize a style of politics in which being tough on crime became a test of seriousness, and in which calls for more police and prisons were considered the responsible centrist position. He also helped blur the line between protest and crime. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, student demonstrators, anti-war activists, Black Panthers, and other groups were often portrayed not just as opponents, but as threats to order itself. Law and order politics made little distinction between someone throwing a brick and someone marching without a permit. This framing mattered. If protest is seen as disorder, then crackdowns can be sold as restoring calm, not limiting rights. If neighborhoods are described as high-crime areas, then aggressive tactics, stop and frisk, mass sweeps, raids, begin to feel normal to those who do not live there. That pattern, refined under Nixon, would echo through later decades, in the rhetoric of the 1980s crack era, in the 1990s crime bills, in the language of superpredators and zero tolerance. The numbers tell part of the story. In 1970, before the full machinery of the modern drug war and tough on-crime politics came into being, the United States incarcerated far fewer people than it does today. Over the next few decades, the prison and jail population would explode, growing by hundreds of %. Nixon's specific policies were only one stage in that growth. Later presidents, both Republican and Democrat, would deepen and expand them. But he helped set the direction, making it politically rewarding to promise more punishment and politically risky to argue for less. If you live in America today, you live with the consequences. The size of the prison system, the number of people on probation and parole, the presence of SWAT teams and militarized equipment in local police departments, mandatory minimum sentences for certain drug offenses, the federal role in funding and shaping local law enforcement. All of these were strengthened by patterns that took form under a president who spoke constantly of law and order. You can hear his echo when politicians talk about cracking down or restoring order without talking much about schools, jobs, or housing. When drug use is framed primarily as a criminal problem rather than a public health issue. When calls for reform have to push against decades of habits built in response to a political strategy from the late 1960s. And you can see his legacy in public debates about race and policing. When protests erupt after a police killing, some leaders focus first on broken windows and looting, not on the death that sparked the anger. That hierarchy of concern, that instinct to treat disorder as the primary problem, was sharpened in Nixon's time. So the same presidency that created agencies to measure air quality also helped create a political climate that measured leaders by arrest rates. The same man who talked about returning power to the states also drew Washington more deeply into defining crime and punishment. If you have ever heard a campaign ad promising to be tougher on crime, if you know someone who went to prison for a nonviolent drug offense, if your city's budget depends on federal grants for police equipment, you are still living in the world Nixon helped build, where law and order is not just a slogan, but a structure woven into statutes, institutions, and the daily rhythms of public life. While Nixon was reshaping crime policy and the language of order, something else was happening in the background. The American economy, the thing that had seemed so stable, so reliable in the decades after World War II, was starting to wobble. For a long time, there had been a kind of quiet confidence. The United States had come out of the war as the dominant industrial power. Factories hummed, wages rose, unemployment, though it went up and down, stayed relatively low. Inflation, the rate at which prices rise, was usually modest. Under Nixon, that picture began to change. By the late 1960s, the United States was fighting an expensive war in Vietnam and funding ambitious social programs at home. President Johnson had tried to do both without raising taxes enough to pay for them. That meant more government spending flowing into the economy without enough revenue to balance it. Demand was high, factories were busy, but the bill was coming due. Prices started to creep upward. The cost of food, rent, and everyday goods edged higher. Workers pushed for wage increases to keep up. Businesses raised prices again to cover their higher costs. The cycle fed on itself. At the same time, foreign competition was beginning to matter more. Japan and Western Europe, rebuilt from the ruins of war, were now exporting cars, electronics, and machinery. American companies that had once dominated global markets began to feel pressure. Trade balances shifted. The United States, which had long run trade surpluses, started to see deficits. Nixon inherited an economy already under strain, but the choices he made would turn that strain into a turning point. One of the most dramatic decisions came in August 1971. Up to that point, the global monetary system had been anchored by the Bretton Woods Agreement, made at the end of World War II. Under Bretton Woods, most major currencies were pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold at a fixed rate, $35 for an ounce. Foreign governments could hold dollars and, if they wished, exchange those dollars for US gold. That promise gave the dollar credibility. It was as good as gold, literally. But by the late 1960s and early 1970s, the math no longer worked. The US had been sending dollars overseas through military spending, foreign aid, and investment. Other countries accumulated huge reserves of dollars. At the same time, America's gold stockpile was not growing to match. In fact, it was shrinking as nations like France began to trade in their dollars for gold. There were more dollars in the world than the US could possibly convert into gold at the promised rate. If everyone tried to cash in at once, the system would collapse. Nixon, facing mounting pressure, chose to act. On a Sunday evening in August 1971, he appeared on television and announced what would later be called the Nixon shock. Among several measures, he unilaterally closed the gold window. The United States would no longer allow foreign governments to exchange dollars for gold at a fixed rate. That decision effectively ended the Bretton Woods system. Over time, currencies that had once been tied to the dollar at fixed values began to float, allowed to rise and fall based on supply and demand in global markets. Exchange rates became more flexible but also more unpredictable. Speculation increased. The world moved into the era of modern global finance. For everyday Americans, this might have seemed distant. Most people never touched gold bars or worried about exchange rates. But the change rippled into ordinary life. A weaker floating dollar could make imports more expensive. It could make trips abroad costlier. It could shift where factories chose to locate, where companies bought their raw materials, and how investors moved money around the world. The shock also included something that felt much more immediate. Nixon announced a 90-day freeze on wages and prices. In a country that had long celebrated free markets and private contracts, The federal government was suddenly, directly telling businesses they could not raise prices and telling workers they could not negotiate higher pay. After the freeze, the administration moved into a system of controlled increases, overseen by government boards. Nixon was not a natural economic planner. He had often criticized government interference in markets, but he was also a politician staring at rising inflation and an election calendar. His advisors warned him that letting prices rise freely would be unpopular. Voters would blame him. So he embraced tools that economists usually associated with wartime or emergency, direct controls. For a while it seemed to work. Inflation slowed temporarily. The public, at first, liked the idea that someone was finally doing something about rising costs. Nixon's approval ratings improved. He sailed into a landslide re-election in 1972. But economic reality did not disappear. It just shifted. When controls are in place, people often find ways to work around them. Shortages can develop, quality can slip. When controls are lifted, the underlying pressures often come roaring back. That's what happened. As controls were relaxed, prices began to jump again. By the mid-1970s, the United States was dealing with something it had rarely seen before: high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. Economists called it stagflation. In the post-war era, many policymakers had believed inflation and unemployment moved in opposite directions. If you wanted lower unemployment, you might accept a bit more inflation. If you wanted lower inflation, you'd accept a bit more unemployment. Nixon's years helped break that comforting rule of thumb. You could now have both problems at once: people out of work and the cost of living rising quickly. That combination made economic policy much harder. Raise interest rates to fight inflation, and you might throw more people out of jobs. Stimulate the economy to fight unemployment, and you might push prices up further. The sense of stability that had characterized the 1950s and early 1960s was gone. Families felt it in simple ways. Grocery bills took a larger share of paychecks. Mortgage rates rose. Gas prices, especially after the 1973 oil shock that followed the Arab-Israeli War, spiked sharply. For the first time, many Americans saw gasoline lines and "no gas today" signs. If you grew up in that era, the memory of prices that just kept climbing sank deep into your bones. Politicians remembered too. The experience of inflation under Nixon and the presidents who followed shaped decades of debate. It strengthened a new generation of economists and policymakers who argued that central banks should focus first on keeping prices stable, even if that meant tolerating higher unemployment at times. It helped fuel the rise of more market-oriented approaches: deregulation, emphasis on controlling the money supply, and skepticism about wage and price controls. It also laid part of the groundwork for the modern age of globalization. Once the dollar was no longer tied to gold, and once exchange rates could move more freely, it became easier for capital to flow rapidly across borders. Companies could shift production to other countries more easily. Investors could move money where returns seemed highest, sometimes in minutes or seconds rather than days. In later decades, that flexibility would be praised as efficiency and criticized as instability. But the moment when the United States stepped away from gold and toward floating currencies, the Nixon shock was a crucial hinge. You live with its consequences whenever a news story mentions the Federal Reserve adjusting interest rates to fight inflation, whenever a report explains that a strong dollar makes imports cheaper but exports harder to sell, whenever a politician argues that globalization has moved jobs overseas, or that trade agreements are necessary to keep the economy competitive. You also feel it in quieter, more personal ways, in the assumption that prices will rise a little every year, instead of staying almost flat, in the idea that the stock market responds instantly to decisions made in Washington or central banks abroad, in the way retirement plans, mortgages, and even student loans are shaped by expectations about inflation, interest rates, and global capital flows. Nixon did not create all of these trends. The forces behind them were large and slow-moving: war spending, technological change, rebuilding economies abroad, the politics of oil. But his presidency marked a pivot point. He chose wage and price controls, tying the presidency closely to the fight against inflation. He chose to end the dollar's link to gold, pulling a pin out of the post-war financial order and watching a new, more fluid, more volatile system emerge. From that point on, American presidents would govern in a world where money moved faster, prices rose more unpredictably, and the health of the economy depended not just on domestic factories and farms, but on decisions in Tokyo, Frankfurt, Riyadh, and beyond. If you worry about inflation when you go to the store, if your job depends on global supply chains, if your savings rise and fall with interest rate announcements, you are living in part in the economic world that took shape under Richard Nixon, when an old order cracked and a new one, uncertain and restless, began. As the economy shifted and the old financial order cracked, something else was hardening inside the Nixon White House. A way of thinking. By the early 1970s, Nixon did not just see himself as a president wrestling with inflation, war, and foreign policy. He saw himself as a man under siege. At the center of that siege in his mind was the press. Nixon had never liked journalists. His first big campaign back in the late 1940s had been fueled by red baiting and harsh attacks on his opponents. Many reporters criticized his tactics, and he remembered it. He believed the Eastern establishment and the major newspapers had always looked down on him, a poor boy from Yorba Linda, not a polished Harvard man. By the time he reached the presidency, that old resentment had become a defining lens. Television made it worse. Reporters were no longer just bylines. They were faces on the evening news. Walter Cronkite criticizing the war in Vietnam mattered more than an editorial on a back page. Investigative journalists could tear apart a policy in front of millions of viewers at dinner time. Nixon watched. He also never forgot that in 1960, during his first run for president, the televised debates against John F. Kennedy had gone badly for him. Viewers thought Kennedy looked confident and youthful. Nixon, recovering from illness, looked pale and sweaty. He believed the media had helped tip that election away from him. So when he came back to power in 1968, he brought with him a long list of grudges. In public, his team talked about the silent majority, the hardworking Americans they believed were ignored by liberal elites in New York and Washington. In private, Nixon and his aides talked about the enemy. Sometimes that enemy was vague: intellectuals, protesters, the establishment. Sometimes it was very specific: a particular columnist, a television network, a newspaper editor. Inside the White House, this mindset turned into something concrete: an actual enemies list. Staff members drew up names of people and organizations the administration considered hostile: journalists, activists, donors to the opposition, celebrities who criticized the war. The list was not a single neat document at first. It grew through memos, conversations, and internal proposals. The idea was not just emotional payback, it was transactional. Could the IRS be used to audit someone on the list? Could security clearances be denied? Could federal contracts be steered away from unfriendly businesses? The list became a tool for thinking about how presidential power might be used not only to govern, but to punish. For many of the people named, nothing dramatic happened. For others, there were real consequences: unexpected tax audits, sudden scrutiny, obstacles in careers that touched the federal government. What mattered, beyond any single case, was the culture this reflected and reinforced. Loyalty became the supreme virtue in Nixon's inner circle. Loyalty to him personally, not just to the office or to the Constitution. Aides were expected to see the world as he did, us against them, surrounded by enemies, with the press acting as a hostile force. That culture shaped day-to-day decision-making. When leaks appeared in the newspapers, stories based on confidential documents, anonymous sources, insider accounts, Nixon did not treat them simply as a nuisance. He treated them as a kind of treason. The most famous example came in 1971, with the publication of the Pentagon Papers. These were classified Defense Department studies about the Vietnam War, covering the decisions of multiple presidents before Nixon. They revealed, in dry, bureaucratic language, a long history of deception, public optimism paired with private doubt, casualty estimates massaged, timelines stretched. The New York Times began publishing excerpts. Nixon, whose own administration was not the main target of the documents, could have allowed the political damage to fall mostly on his predecessors. Instead, he saw the leak as a direct assault on presidential authority. If someone could take thousands of pages of secret government documents and hand them to the press, what else could they do? What would that mean for negotiations with foreign powers, for war planning, For day-to-day candid discussions inside the executive branch, he decided to fight. The administration went to court to try to stop publication, arguing that national security was at stake. This led to a major Supreme Court case, New York Times Co. v. United States. The court, in a landmark decision, ruled that the government had not met the heavy burden required for prior restraint. The newspapers could continue publishing. Nixon lost that legal battle. But he did not give up the larger war against leaks. Instead, the White House doubled down on secrecy. A special unit was created to track down leakers and plug what they saw as holes in the system. The men who staffed it would become known by a nickname that sounded almost comic, the plumbers. Their work, however, was not funny. They broke into offices. They rifled through files. They looked for dirt on perceived enemies. The same culture of suspicion that had produced the enemies list now fueled covert operations. Surveillance expanded. Nixon and his aides pushed the FBI, the CIA, and other agencies to keep closer tabs on protesters, dissidents, and even members of the press. They explored ways to use national security justifications to monitor people they considered politically dangerous. Some of this drew on habits that had existed before Nixon. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had long spied on civil rights leaders, leftist groups, and others. But Nixon's White House brought those methods into an even closer embrace with presidential politics. Wiretaps were placed on journalists and officials suspected of leaking. Conversations were recorded. Sensitive information was hoarded in secure rooms. The presidency wrapped itself in secrecy not only to protect genuine national security interests, but also to shield internal maneuvering from scrutiny. At the same time, Nixon and his advisors argued for a strong theory of presidential power. They said the president needed broad authority, especially in foreign policy and national security, to act decisively. They claimed that too much interference from Congress, or too much exposure in the press, would cripple the executive's ability to protect the country. In public, this often took the form of criticizing an irresponsible media that, in their view, put sensational stories ahead of national interest. In private, it took the form of legal arguments that the president had inherent powers not easily checked by other branches. Nixon once told an interviewer after he left office that when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. It was a clumsy way of saying something his administration had often acted on, that the needs of the presidency could reshape the meaning of law. The clash between this view and the press's insistence on publishing leaked information set patterns that echo today. Modern presidents still face investigative reporters digging into classified programs and secret memos. They still argue that certain details cannot be disclosed without harming national security. They still condemn leaks and sometimes pursue the people who provide them. Journalists, in turn, still point back to decisions like the Pentagon Papers case and to the Nixon years as evidence that aggressive reporting on government power is not just allowed, but essential. The language we hear now about enemies, witch hunts, fake news, leakers, and the deep state did not begin entirely with Nixon. But his presidency fused many of these themes into a visible, dramatic confrontation. He showed how a president could use the tools of government to monitor opponents, harass critics, and seek revenge for bad coverage. He also showed how a free press, backed by courts willing to limit prior restraint, could push back. You live with this legacy every time a major leak hits the news and the White House responds by condemning the source. Every time a president refuses to turn over documents, citing executive privilege. Every time an administration debates whether to prosecute someone under the Espionage Act for sharing classified information with the press. The uneasy relationship between the executive branch and the media, the mix of dependence, hostility, performance, and genuine oversight, took on its modern shape during Nixon's years. A president who felt besieged, a press emboldened by television and investigative tools, and a public slowly losing faith in official narratives combined to create a new kind of permanent tension. It is the tension you see whenever cameras line up on a White House driveway, waiting for a statement. Whenever a reporter's question about a secret program makes an official visibly uncomfortable. Whenever a president complains about coverage, even as they use media to speak directly to supporters. Nixon did not invent the conflict between power and scrutiny, but he turned it into a core drama of modern American politics, a drama that still plays out in headlines, hearings, and late-night news conferences long after his presidency ended. By 1972, that drama was no longer just about leaks and angry editorials. It was about burglars, On the night of June 17, 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. They were not teenagers on a dare. They had walkie-talkies, cameras, rolls of film, and sophisticated bugging equipment. They wore rubber gloves. They had tape for doors, tools for locks. They also had cash. A lot of it, much of it in $100 bills. Many of the serial numbers matched. At first, the story looked like something from a strange crime novel: Cuban exiles, a former CIA officer, and a break-in at the opposition party's national office in the middle of a presidential campaign. On the surface, it didn't make sense. Richard Nixon was favored to win re-election. The Democratic Party was divided and exhausted by years of Vietnam and internal fights. The president did not need a gang of burglars and wiretappers to secure victory. But the mindset inside the Nixon orbit did not work on need. It worked on fear and control. Running Nixon's re-election effort was an organization with an almost self-parodying name: the Committee to Re-elect the President. Its initials, CREEP, matched the tone of some of its tactics. Officially, it was a standard campaign committee, raising money, buying ads, organizing rallies. Unofficially, it became a hub for what were politely called political intelligence and dirty tricks. The men who had cut their teeth on the enemy's list and the plumbers unit brought their habits with them. They funneled cash in secret ways, using campaign donations and slush funds. They paid operatives to spy on Democrats, infiltrate meetings, and steal documents. They spread forged letters and planted rumors. They tried to sabotage opponents not just by arguing against them, but by embarrassing them, confusing them, and making their campaigns collapse from within. Watergate was not a random one-off. It was part of that broader pattern. The burglars who crept into the Democratic offices had already been there once, weeks earlier, to install listening devices. The June break-in was, in part, an attempt to fix faulty bugs and gather more material. The mission was clumsy. One of the security guards noticed tape on a door latch and called the police. The patrol officers who responded were in plain clothes, so the burglars assumed they were fellow conspirators. They were wrong. Within hours, the men were in custody, and reporters were trying to figure out why people with CIA backgrounds and White House connections were prowling around the DNC at 2:00 a.m. From the Nixon administration's point of view, this was a crisis, but not yet a fatal one. Presidents had weathered scandals before. The instinct was to contain, minimize, and move on. That instinct was immediate. Within days, senior aides were discussing how to keep the arrest from touching the Oval Office. They talked about stonewalling investigations. They talked about limiting FBI inquiries. They talked about ways to pay the burglars legal fees and even hush money to keep them quiet. The public story was simple and dismissive. This was a third-rate burglary, stupid and isolated. No one in the White House had known about it. The president himself, they insisted, was as shocked as anyone. Many people accepted that at first. Nixon's approval rating stayed high. The 1972 campaign rolled forward. He won re-election in a landslide that November, taking 49 states. In traditional political logic, a president buoyed by such a victory could probably ride out an ugly but distant scandal. That outcome seemed likely in the early months after the break-in, except for one thing. The story refused to die. It refused to die because there was more there, and because some people were determined to keep digging. At the Washington Post, two relatively young reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, were assigned what initially looked like a routine crime story. They started asking basic questions. Who were the burglars? Who paid their lawyers? Why did they have connections to the Nixon campaign? Why did a senior official at the re-election committee have a check that linked back to the cash found on them? Each answer led to another question. They knocked on doors. They worked the phones. They met sources in parking garages. They followed money trails from the burglars back to campaign accounts. They found that one of the burglars had an address book with a White House phone number in it. They uncovered secret funds used for political espionage. Their stories did not immediately transform public opinion. Many editors at other outlets were skeptical. The White House denied everything and accused the Washington Post of bias. There was no single dramatic revelation at the beginning, just a slow drip of details that made the official story look thinner and thinner. But that drip mattered. It kept Watergate in the news long after the campaign should have buried it. It attracted the attention of judges, especially the one overseeing the burglary trial, who wondered why low-level operatives seemed so protected. It kept pressure on the FBI and prosecutors to take the case seriously. It placed names, dates, and dollar amounts into the public record. Inside the administration, the effort to contain the damage grew more frantic. Top aides, including H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, worked on what they called the cover-up. They pushed federal agencies to limit their investigations. They discussed using the CIA to tell the FBI to back off, under the claim that the case touched on national security. They coordinated stories among witnesses. In the short term, they succeeded. There was no immediate smoking gun tying Nixon personally to the break-in. The president publicly declared that no one in the White House was involved. His press secretary mocked the idea that such a clumsy operation could be part of a grand conspiracy. But secrets are hard to manage when many people share them, and when some of those people feel abandoned. One of the first big cracks came from within the Justice Department. The acting director of the FBI, L. Patrick Gray, admitted during later testimony that White House aides had been given access to FBI files on the investigation, an unusual and troubling detail. Another crack appeared when one of the conspirators, James McCord, wrote a letter to the judge in the burglary case. He said there had been political pressure to keep quiet, and that higher officials were involved. Those moments changed the story from a failed burglary into something larger, a possible obstruction of justice. In the Senate, members from both parties started to worry that the normal processes of law enforcement were being distorted. They pushed for a special investigation. Plans for what would become the Senate Watergate Committee began to take shape. Television would soon carry hearings into American living rooms. The sense that this was containable began to slip. Nixon still had the presidency, the power of the office, and the aura of a huge electoral win. He still had loyalists who believed the whole thing was overblown or partisan. He still believed that strong executive power, wrapped in claims of national security, could push back against meddling questions. But the pattern that had defined his inner circle, secrecy, loyalty, and the creative use of government power to manage enemies, had now produced something harder to control. A burglary, a cover-up, and a handful of determined investigators had combined to create a situation where every new revelation raised more basic questions about how far a president and his men could go. The battle over those questions would soon move from quiet back channels to televised hearings, courtrooms, and, eventually, the Supreme Court. The presidency that had seemed almost invincible after 1972 was about to start unraveling, thread by thread. Televised hearings in Washington are not usually the stuff of national drama. But in the spring of 1973, millions of Americans began falling asleep or staying up late while the same slow, careful voices played from their TV sets. The Senate Watergate Committee had begun its hearings. Chaired by Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, an elderly constitutional scholar with a gentle drawl, the committee was bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans sat side by side, asking questions that cut through party lines. The country, weary from Vietnam and political fights, tuned in anyway. They watched White House aides, campaign staffers, and lawyers raise their right hands, swear an oath, and tell versions of what had happened. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged. Former White House counsel John Dean became one of the most important witnesses. Soft-spoken, with wire-rimmed glasses and a careful manner, he had been in the room for key conversations. He described meetings in which he, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and the president discussed how to contain Watergate, how to keep the FBI from following money trails, how to keep the burglars quiet, how to coordinate stories. Dean used a phrase that stuck. He called it a cancer on the presidency. He testified that he had warned Nixon that this cancer would grow, that the cover-up was riskier than the original crime. He described delivering hush money. He described shredded documents. He placed the president closer to the center of the story than the White House had ever acknowledged. Other witnesses filled in other parts. Campaign officials talked about secret funds. Former Attorney General John Mitchell, who had chaired the re-election campaign, was drawn into questions about authorizing political espionage. Staffers described the culture inside the administration, where enemies were tracked, agencies were pressured, and legal lines were treated as suggestions. Still, many of these accounts involved memories and impressions. Nixon denied Dean's version. Supporters could say it was one man's word against another's. Then, in July 1973, a staffer named Alexander Butterfield changed everything with one quiet disclosure. Butterfield, A former deputy assistant to the president was asked a routine question. Was there any kind of recording system in the Oval Office? Yes, he replied. Since 1971, most of Nixon's conversations in the Oval Office, the Cabinet Room, and some other locations had been recorded automatically on a secret taping system. Voice activated. Comprehensive. There were tapes, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. In that moment, Watergate became more than testimony and notes. It became a question of what, exactly, the President of the United States had said behind closed doors, in his own voice. The tapes were dangerous for Nixon for the same reason they interested everyone else. They were objective evidence. If they confirmed Dean's account, they could directly implicate the president in obstruction of justice. If they contradicted it, they could rescue him. But to find out, someone had to get them. The Senate committee and the special prosecutor appointed to handle Watergate, Archibald Cox, both subpoenaed the tapes. Nixon refused. He claimed executive privilege, the idea that the president needs confidential communications with his advisors to do his job, and that those communications should be shielded from outside demands. Executive privilege is a real concept in American law, but it is not absolute. Nixon offered a compromise. He would provide written summaries. Cox insisted on the actual recordings. The dispute escalated. It became not just about Watergate, but about whether a president could withhold evidence in a criminal investigation. The confrontation came to a head in October 1973, in a sequence of events that became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. On a Saturday evening, Nixon ordered his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox, the special prosecutor who kept pressing for the tapes. Richardson refused. He had promised Congress that Cox would be independent. Rather than break that promise, he resigned. Nixon then turned to the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, and gave him the same order. Ruckelshaus also refused, and he too resigned. Finally, the order reached the next in line, Solicitor General Robert Bork. Bork carried it out. Cox was dismissed. FBI agents were sent to seal the special prosecutor's offices. In a single night, the president had tried to decapitate the investigation into his own administration. To many Americans, it felt like something from another system of government, a move you might expect in a fragile dictatorship, not in a constitutional republic. Newspapers used words like constitutional crisis. Members of Congress from both parties wondered whether the rule of law was being openly defied. Public reaction was swift and severe. Protests formed. Editorials raged. Poll numbers plunged. The House of Representatives began more serious discussions of impeachment, not as a distant possibility, but as a practical path. Under pressure, Nixon accepted the appointment of a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, and the legal fight over the tapes continued. The question was simple but profound. Could the president refuse a judicial subpoena for evidence in a criminal case? Courts moved cautiously but steadily. The issue climbed toward the highest court in the land. In July 1974, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in United States v. Nixon. It was unanimous, 8-0. One justice recused himself. The court recognized that executive privilege existed, but it drew a clear line. It could not be used to block the production of evidence in a criminal trial, especially when the need for that evidence was specific and demonstrated. The tapes had to be turned over. In that moment, the presidency bowed to the judiciary. A president could not simply declare his conversations off limits if they contained potential proof of crimes. The decision reinforced a principle that still shapes government today. No person, not even the president, is above the law. When the tapes were finally released to investigators, they contained many hours of mundane talk schedules, politics, gossip, but they also contained what had long been suspected. On one tape from June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the Watergate break, Nixon can be heard discussing how to use the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation. It was direct evidence that the president had participated in the cover-up from the beginning. This recording became known as the smoking gun tape. Its impact was immediate. Republican leaders who had stood by Nixon, or at least withheld judgment, quietly went to the White House and told him the reality. After this tape, his support in Congress had collapsed. The House Judiciary Committee had already approved articles of impeachment for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Now, even longtime allies could not defend him on the floor of the House or the Senate. Cabinet members resigned, party elders distanced themselves. Polls showed that most Americans believed he should be removed from office. The unraveling that had begun with a single burglary then moved through investigative reporting, televised hearings, and a legal showdown had come to its final stage. The system of checks and balances, Congress, courts, public opinion, and even the president's own party had turned against him. What remained was a question of timing and form. Would Richard Nixon be impeached and tried in the Senate, or would he step down before that could happen? The presidency that had once promised order, control, and strength had been undone, in large part by its own methods, by secrecy, loyalty tests, and a belief that power could manage any problem. The last thread was about to snap. On the night of August 7, 1974, the last thread finally did snap. Republican leaders had come, in person, to tell Richard Nixon what the votes in the House and Senate would be. Barry Goldwater, Hugh Scott, John Rhodes, men who had defended him, or at least delayed judgment, now laid out the arithmetic. If the House impeached him, and it would, the Senate would not save him. Nixon, who had spent his life counting votes, understood the numbers. For 2 more days, the White House was a place of closed doors and late discussions. Resignation was not something the Constitution had ever expected to become routine. Only one president, more than a century earlier, had even come close to being removed. There was no script for how to quit the most powerful office in the country. On August 8, Nixon went on national television. His speech was calm, controlled, almost detached. He did not admit criminal guilt. Instead, he spoke of losing his political base, of not having enough support in Congress to govern effectively, of choosing the interests of the nation over his own. He announced that he would resign the presidency, effective at noon the next day. Millions watched in silence. Some were angry, some were relieved. Some simply felt tired after years of Vietnam, protests, and scandal. The next morning, August 9, Richard Nixon became the first president in American history to resign. He said goodbye to his staff in a long, emotional speech in the East Room, speaking of his parents, his brother, his setbacks, his faith and resilience. He and his family walked across the South Lawn to a waiting helicopter. As the blade spun, he turned at the top of the steps, raised both arms, and flashed his familiar V for Victory sign. Then the helicopter lifted off, and the Nixon presidency became part of history. At noon, Gerald Ford, the quiet Midwestern congressman who had been appointed vice president less than a year earlier, took the oath of office. His first words as president included a sentence that echoed through the country: "Our long national nightmare is over." But the nightmare did not really end with the oath. It shifted. Now there were questions of accountability. Nixon had not been tried. The criminal investigations continued. Courts and grand juries weighed whether a former president could be indicted. The country was divided over what justice and healing should look like. Gerald Ford, who wanted to move the country past Watergate, faced an impossible choice. On September 8, 1974, just 1 month after taking office, Ford went on television and announced that he was granting Richard Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon for any crimes he might have committed as president. The language was broad and preemptive. It covered all federal offenses Nixon has committed or may have committed or taken part in during his time in office. Ford said he acted to spare the country years of bitter controversy and divisive national debate. He spoke of mercy, of bringing closure, of allowing Americans to make a full-time job of our jobs instead of reliving Watergate through a prolonged trial. To many Americans, it sounded like something else, a deal. Polls, which had shown Ford as personally popular, turned sharply downward. Letters poured into the White House, most of them critical. Members of Congress demanded explanations. Ford was even called to testify before a House subcommittee, the first sitting president in more than a century to do so, to answer whether any promises had been made to Nixon in exchange for his resignation. Ford insisted there had been no bargain. Historians still debate the private conversations, but the public effect was clear. The pardon protected Nixon from criminal prosecution. It also convinced millions of people that powerful officials played by different rules than everyone else. The message many heard was simple. If you're ordinary and break the law, you can go to trial. If you're a president and break the law, you might get a pardon in the name of national healing. That sense of unequal accountability sank deep into public memory. In the years after Watergate, whenever new scandals emerged, whether Iran-Contra in the 1980s or debates over torture and surveillance after 9/11, people remembered 1974. They ask whether moving on would again mean sparing top officials from serious consequences. Ford paid a political price. He lost the 1976 election by a narrow margin, and the pardon was one of the reasons. Some historians, though, have later praised the decision as an act of political self-sacrifice, arguing that he did what he believed was right, knowing it could cost him the presidency. That too became part of the story. A president who pardoned his predecessor, and a public that never fully agreed whether it was an act of courage or an evasion of justice. And what of Nixon himself, now back in private life? He returned to his home in San Clemente, California, disgraced, physically exhausted, and politically radioactive. For a time, he was a symbol of failure. Jokes, cartoons, late-night routines all circled the same image of a fallen president who had resigned rather than face trial. But Nixon was not a man who accepted exile easily. Slowly, carefully, he began to rebuild. He wrote his memoirs. Then he wrote more books, focused on foreign policy, strategy, and the global balance of power. He gave interviews, starting with friendly ones, then gradually moving to tougher settings. Foreign leaders, who often care more about skill than scandal, never entirely turned away. They had worked with Nixon when he was in office. They knew his habit of thinking in long strategic arcs. Behind the scenes, some presidents found that, too, was useful. By the 1980s, Ronald Reagan's White House occasionally consulted Nixon on dealings with the Soviet Union and China. In the early 1990s, Bill Clinton also spoke with him about Russia after the collapse of the USSR. Nixon traveled abroad, met with leaders, and sent back memos full of advice. He had no formal position, no clear authority, but he still had something presidents valued: experience navigating a dangerous world. Over time, media coverage shifted, at least in part. Reporters still used the word Watergate when they said his name, but they also began to call him an elder statesman. TV segments showed him in meetings with foreign officials, speaking in measured tones about nuclear arms, trade, and regional conflicts. For some Americans, especially younger ones who had not watched the hearings live, Nixon began to seem less like a villain and more like a complex, oddly resilient figure, a man who had opened China and also resigned in disgrace, who had bombed Cambodia and also signed key environmental and civil rights laws. Historians wrestled with the same contradictions. On one side of the ledger, Watergate, the enemy's lists, the illegal surveillance, the abuse of the FBI and CIA, the secret bombings, the contempt for legal limits. On the other side, détente with the Soviet Union, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the opening to China, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the expansion of Social Security, and affirmative action in federal contracting. Some scholars emphasize the achievements, arguing that Nixon was one of the most consequential foreign policy presidents of the 20th century, whose strategic vision helped stabilize a dangerous nuclear rivalry. Others focused on the damage he did to democratic norms, pointing out that his approach to power, seeing opponents as enemies, treating law as an obstacle to be circumvented, eroded public trust in government for generations. Most eventually landed somewhere in the middle, describing him as a deeply flawed, highly capable, and ultimately self-destroying leader. But even as books and documentaries tried to balance the scales, another reality remained. Nixon's methods and mindset never fully left American politics. Every time a president invokes executive privilege, journalists and lawyers remember United States v. Nixon. Every time a scandal is compared to another Watergate, his name returns as shorthand for abuse of power. Every debate over whether to prosecute former officials carries the shadow of the Ford pardon. The language of cover-up, plausible deniability, and dirty tricks stayed in the political vocabulary long after Nixon left the stage. Some campaigns copied his tactics, others defined themselves in opposition to them. Even the way Americans think about the presidency, less as a distant, dignified office, and more as a fallible institution that must be constantly watched, was shaped by watching Nixon fall. He died in 1994, after a stroke, and was buried on the grounds of his presidential library in Yorba Linda, not far from the house where he had been born. But in a very real sense, he never entirely left. His choices, his downfall, and his partial rehabilitation continued to echo through court decisions, political calculations, and public skepticism. To understand how much of your daily political environment still carries his imprint, we need to look more closely at the specific ways Richard Nixon continues to shape your life, long after that helicopter lifted off from the White House lawn. If you live in the United States, you live in Nixon's constitutional house. The walls have been repainted. Some of the furniture has been moved. A few locks have been added to the doors. But the basic floor plan, the way presidents think about secrecy, power, and the public, is still very much his. Start with executive power. Before Nixon, presidents kept secrets, pushed boundaries, and used the national security argument when it suited them. But there was still a stronger sense, at least in public, that the White House answered to Congress and the courts. Nixon did not see it that way. He spoke openly in private conversations later made public about the idea that when the president does it, that means it is not illegal. He treated the executive branch as something like a personal instrument, using the FBI, CIA, and IRS against perceived enemies. Watergate forced a formal answer to that claim. In United States v. Nixon, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that while executive privilege exists, it is not absolute. A president cannot hide behind secrecy to block criminal investigations. That ruling is now part of the air your government breathes. Every time a president refuses to turn over documents or claims certain conversations are protected, lawyers and judges cite that 1974 case. Every modern clash over subpoenas, tapes, emails, and testimony is conducted on the legal battlefield that Nixon created and then lost. And yet, his style of secrecy survived him. Presidents of both parties have expanded the national security state, classified more information, and used executive orders and signing statements to shape policy without going through Congress. The idea that the presidency is a powerful, semi-independent center of government, able to take dramatic action first and explain later, owes a great deal to the Nixon era, even when later presidents claimed to be rejecting his example. Nixon also helped write the script for modern political polarization. His silent majority speech in 1969 was more than a plea for support on Vietnam. It was a way of dividing the country into two camps: the noisy protesters and the quiet, forgotten Americans, the elites and the real people. That language has never really gone away. When politicians today talk about real America or frame elections as struggles between coastal elites and heartland voters, they are using a vocabulary Nixon helped popularize. His Southern strategy, appealing to white voters in the South who were uneasy or hostile towards civil rights changes, reshaped the electoral map. Over time, white conservatives moved into the Republican Party. Many African Americans, already leaning Democratic since the New Deal and civil rights laws, became even more firmly aligned there. The party sorted not just by economics, but by race, region, and cultural identity. You can see the results in modern elections: red and blue states, solid partisan blocs, and campaigns built around wedge issues designed to energize one side and alarm the other. That structure did not begin with Nixon, but he accelerated and normalized it, treating politics as permanent combat in which mobilizing your base was more important than persuading the middle. Even policies you might not associate with him sit quietly in your daily life. Environmental rules, for instance. Nixon did not enter office as a green crusader. But under pressure from a growing environmental movement, and in a political climate where both parties still competed to look responsible on public health, he signed some of the most important environmental laws in American history. The National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. When your city measures smog levels, when factories need permits for what they discharge into rivers, when environmental impact statements are required for major projects, those systems trace back to laws Nixon approved. Debates today over rolling back or strengthening those regulations are, in a sense, arguments about how much of Nixon's environmental legacy should remain. On another front, his approach has aged very differently. Nixon declared a war on drugs in 1971. He created the Drug Enforcement Administration. He pushed for tougher penalties on certain substances, while his advisors spoke in private about using drug policy as a way to target political opponents and communities they saw as hostile young anti-war activists and Black Americans. The laws and attitudes from that era helped lay the groundwork for mass incarceration, mandatory minimum sentences, and a criminal justice system that has been criticized for racial disparities and harsh punishments for nonviolent offenses. If your town holds debates about decriminalizing marijuana, sentencing reform, or police practices, you're hearing aftershocks of choices made in the Nixon years. Economically, too, his fingerprints linger. Nixon ended the direct link between the dollar and gold in 1971, effectively closing the Bretton Woods system. That decision pushed the world more fully into the era of floating exchange rates and global capital flows. The economy you live in, where currencies fluctuate, markets respond instantly to news, and international trade and finance are deeply intertwined, grew out of that shift. It made some forms of economic management harder, created new tools for others, and helped set the stage for the inflation and turbulence of the 1970s that scarred a generation of voters. And then there is Watergate itself, which did something less tangible but just as lasting. It cracked the public's faith. Before Nixon, many Americans still held a default assumption that government officials, while imperfect, generally told the truth. After the Pentagon Papers and Watergate, that assumption eroded. Polls show trust in government beginning a downward slide in the late 1960s and early 1970s. It never really recovered. Today, skepticism is almost the default setting. When a president speaks, millions of people instinctively ask what is being hidden. Official statements are met with fact-checking, investigative reporting, and online commentary. Conspiracy theories thrive in the same soil as legitimate doubt, making it harder to tell the difference between reasonable scrutiny and wild speculation. Journalism changed too. Watergate turned investigative reporting into a model and a myth. Generations of reporters grew up seeing Woodward and Bernstein as examples. Newsrooms invested more in watchdog work, in exposing hidden wrongdoing, in cultivating sources inside institutions. If you read exposés about corporate misconduct, government surveillance, or hidden lobbying, you're seeing a media culture that decided, after Nixon, that its job was not just to repeat official lines, but to challenge them. Sometimes that has produced real accountability. Sometimes it has produced sensationalism. But the basic posture that power must be examined, and that secrecy is suspicious, was strengthened by watching a president fall, because too few people asked hard questions soon enough. So why does Nixon still feel present, decades after his death? Because the systems he strained, and sometimes broke, had to be rebuilt around the memory of what he did. Congress passed new ethics and campaign finance laws in response to Watergate. Inspectors general, special prosecutors, and whistleblower protections grew in importance. Yet every time those safeguards are tested, his story is quietly in the room, a warning and a template. Presidents still invoke national security to justify secrecy. Parties still court resentments and cultural divides. Drug policy, environmental regulation, and global economic rules still follow tracks laid down in the early 1970s. You do not have to think about Richard Nixon when you turn on a tap, listen to a press conference, or glance at a campaign ad. But the shape of those experiences, the regulations behind the water, the legal limits on the president's words, the strategy behind the political message, bears the mark of his presidency. He was a complicated man in a restless century, and the country he ruled had to decide afterward what to keep from his time and what to reject. The result is the world you live in now, more suspicious, more polarized, more regulated, more powerful, more constrained, a world where a single presidency, with all its contradictions, still lingers like an echo. Long after the helicopter lifted off, the imprint of Richard Nixon remains, woven into laws, institutions, and habits so ordinary you might not notice them, unless you know where to look.